As you know, I'm fascinated by the medieval period. Today's guest believes that we're currently in the medieval period of our digital lives. Jeremy Silver is an entrepreneur, author, and CEO, and I'm going to talk to him today about what he means by the digital medieval and how it compares to the real medieval. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Future Imperfect. I have another amazing guest here who's going to tell us all about himself. Jeremy, would you like to tell us about yourself and about Digital Catapult and about this book, Digital Medieval Stuff, as well? Because that's fascinating to me.
Hi, Jason. My name's Jeremy Silver. I'm the CEO at Digital Catapult, and I've just written a book called Towards a Digital Renaissance, which is the second book. My first book was called Digital Medieval, which I know is your real area of interest. But the new book is called Towards a Digital Renaissance. So maybe we can talk about both of those things. But by way of introduction to Digital Catapult, it's worth perhaps just a few words. Digital Catapult is an organization that sits between the public and the private sector. We're a private company, but we were set up by Innovate UK, and we're really in business to help other companies adopt new technologies, advanced technologies, and be early adopters of those technologies, particularly in areas where the UK has got strengths on the academic side, but has got potential on the commercial side. And so we're very active in digital infrastructure and things like 5G. We're very busy in the digital supply chain, helping businesses connect and reduce their carbon footprints. And we're really interested in the future of virtualization, the metaverse, digital twins, and the like. And there are about 250 of us, and we're a combination of deep tech geeks and boffins and business analysts and commercial managers of one sort or another.
I think the idea of that is a wonderful one because there's so much shared knowledge which needs to be spread between people. And sometimes when you start your own company or when you're very focused on one small sector, you kind of forget the other parts of it. And if you have an organization that can help you shepherd that communication out, you can actually get to a lot more people and expand the business. And I always think business is about building relationships as much as it is about doing something. And I think relationships are really important. We've all been to those events where we're probably thinking it's not going to be very interesting. And yet you meet a couple of interesting people and you exchange stories. You think, this could be really interesting. And those slightly more spontaneous contact points, I think, are really, really valuable. It's amazing how far we've come in the digital age, though, isn't it? I remember back in the day of dial-up modems and you could almost hear the data going through. And now broadband or fat pipes are the key thing, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're right, though. The value of face-to-face meetings, we all forgot about those during COVID, or perhaps we sort of longed for them nostalgically. But the power of being in the same room with somebody and having that kind of immediacy of dialogue is something we're all beginning to rediscover. And I think, as you say, from a business point of view, you never know when that connection is going to come in useful. And very often you have a brilliant conversation with somebody, you never see them again. And then a couple of years later, you meet them and then something happens in your business. So that's one of the exciting, fun things about being in business.
So tell us about this conceptual digital medieval and digital renaissance, because we all have an idea what the medieval is. And I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts on where that notion comes from or what you actually mean by that.
Well, it's a fairly loose metaphor, it has to be said. So I'm not trying to ground this in some deeply researched academic analogy. But when I wrote Digital Medieval 9 years ago, it was really at the beginning of the power of the GAFA companies, as we talk about them. I suppose we should talk about them as the Gamma companies now. But the Google, Amazon, Facebook, or Meta, and Apple. And it was a reflection on their business models, which I think in a sense today is pretty well understood and recognized by people. And when I say it's recognized by people, it's recognized by people who are working in technology and working in businesses related to online work, but still not necessarily understood by consumers. And that sense of developing a business which is a walled garden, which attracts people in and gives them more and more incentives to stay in, but gradually over time raises the walls of those walled gardens. And so in my mind, as I sort of tracked forward as how that business model played out, it seemed to me that they were going to move from being walled gardens to walled cities. And increasingly that medieval notion of city states sitting in splendid isolation of one another and occasionally trying to trade, but very often sparring and definitely trying to retain their own control over people either within their own walls or the sort of the toiling serfs in the background around them, the sort of supplicants who one way or another had to do business with the city. That picture of the medieval world, and I hesitate to say some of this, Jason, because I know that you're a bit of an expert in medieval things. So
an interested amateur, I would describe myself as.
It's a loose metaphor, but I think it's a useful one in the sense that there is that sense of either you're part of those big players and your business is dependent upon them. And so many of those, whether it's Meta and Facebook or Instagram in particular now, or Google, have a huge ecosystem of surrounding businesses who essentially are predicated on the existence of the platform, and their business is based on the existence of that business model. And that feels not dissimilar to a medieval model. And of course, the other reason for talking about that period, and this is a period really I'm reflecting on, which was perhaps, if you like, the first 20 years of the web, and we're now certainly in the second 20 years of the web. That first period was, very, very experimental, but very, very early on. So I suppose my reading of medieval from that point of view was about its earliness in terms of the generational ideas. And I'm quite interested. I know that you had a really interesting podcast in your series, which talks about the bright ages rather than the dark ages. And you had two brilliant academics talking about that.
Yes, that's fascinating. I mean, what we think of as medieval is obviously only medieval when we look back on it. So nobody ever woke up once the Romans left these islands and went, oh, I'm medieval now, I better do things in a different way. There was quite a long generational series of generations that transitioned, sometimes rapidly, sometimes very slowly, and wanted to continue to identify as Roman for a long time. And then you have this concept that the huge state, the huge administration that was the Roman Empire, because the Romans were just excellent at logistics and administration. They needed to be. And imagine the trouble of logistics when a message travels at the speed of a galloping horse at the very best, or more likely a walking horse at the more normal speed. We all complain about slow internet, but imagine if literally it would take a week to get a message back from London. The internet would be a very different place. There'd be quite a lot of lag in that system.
And in the digital medieval period, that was true. It was. We worked in very, very slow ways compared with the way we do now. And in fact, the conversation we're having today over Zoom was that, well, what was so interesting about it? And that's why I suppose I've made this kind of connection between a digital medieval and a potential for a digital renaissance, is that so many of the ideas that first came up in that early period of the web, I mean, the web was invented. It was published in 1993. That was when the first Mosaic browser that Tim Berners-Lee created was first made available to people. It's not that long ago, really. The ideas all started to emerge from that, but it's taken us the whole of the rest of that period to today to start to see so much of it worked through and become reality, and learn an awful lot along the way, some of which is good and some of which is not so good.
Well, there are actually quite a lot of parallels between the sort of, as you talked about, the city-states or cities having their own status and their own rules. And even then within those cities, you had guilds. So, for example, if you were a saddler in the city of London, you were required to be a member of the Saddlers Guild, and you had fixed prices and fixed things that you were allowed to do. And if you were, for example, let's say an armourer making medieval armour, you were a member of the guild and you paid guild money, and nobody else was allowed to sell armour in the city of London unless you were a member of the guild. It was a closed shop, and it's literally where the term closed shop comes from. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that some of the armour was gilded and bejewelled, but that wasn't done by the armourer. That had to be done by the Jewellers Guild or by the Gilders Guild or the goldsmiths or the silversmiths, depending on which guild and which material was needed. So it was immensely complex, and it controlled standards, actually, interestingly. You were not allowed, if you're a saddle maker, you were not allowed to sell a saddle that was covered, because you could cover a bad saddle with expensive cloth, but it would break, and that would be a problem for the person buying it. So there were controls, but there were also standards, and the internet was a bit like that. There were things that came and went. I mean, people of a certain age will remember any magazine you got, and then magazines are kind of an interesting technology that's changed. But pretty much any magazine, you got an AOL disc, didn't you?
Well, and I think, the remnants of that business model are still visible on the App Store, and the 30% that we pay to Apple every time we want to upload an app for sale or a game for sale there aren't that many business models that exist in the world. We talk a lot about people inventing new business models. It's amazing how few there are, because in the end, you make something, you sell it, and someone pays you for it. The interesting thing, of course, is that, yes, those controls that you talk about, they probably do have their modern analogies. But in a way, the one thing that both Meta and Google have, which is really new, and is perhaps the thing that still really kind of confuses people, and I think probably would have been very confusing in medieval times, is what we talk about as the asymmetric transactional model. So that sense that I can go on Google anytime I want and do a search, and that I'm not aware that I'm actually taking part in a commercial transaction in doing that. And yet the data that I include in that search is then parceled up and sold as part of Google's business model in the back end, as we know. And that sense of not being able to see what the transaction is a really interesting difference between the medieval and the digital medieval.
Yes, it's very much less personal. It's very abstracted, isn't it? In fact, it's fractions of pennies, fractions of groats, fractions of whatever, of shillings, tiny fractions of it, but it all aggregates across the globe. So it's a massive scale operation with tiny, tiny amounts of money, each person being worth. You also have the idea of selling the sizzle, not the sausage, in a lot of valuations of companies. Companies are still growing, and they value the number of people they have in their network, and that has a potential worth in the future. And I wonder whether you see the digital renaissance, how you imagine that fitting in with the changes in rules or changes in weapons or systems or democracy.
The thing that's interesting, as you've described elsewhere, this idea that the medieval period was a dark period of sort of gnashing of teeth and bathing in mud is not quite what's now coming out from a lot of academic research. And what a lot of people are finding is that actually there was an enormous amount of innovation in the medieval period. But it was not until the Renaissance that much of that then kind of consolidated and became real and visible. And again, I think that trajectory in the digital age is something that we can also see as well. And to be honest, I hesitate to apply this analogy too deeply because I think you can stretch it beyond its usefulness. But there is a sense that actually going there and saying, well, that sense of discovery, that sense of how, perspective suddenly could come into artwork, for example, was a way in which we think about the Renaissance period as a period of sudden bursting of creativity. But as lots of historians are now saying, that creativity was rooted in all sorts of innovation that came in the period before. So I think, that's where we are. But I'm hesitant to talk about us actually being in a digital renaissance. I'm sort of looking forward to the idea that we might, if we're lucky, get to one. And if we're unlucky, we might realize a somewhat more dystopian view of the future. And I think in some respects, what I'm exploring in the new book is very much the notion of, well, what do we need to do to make sure that we get something that veers towards something more of a renaissance than something more dystopic? And that's how we start to grapple with some of these questions about what the business is and what business models are and the ethics of all of this.
Well, people often forget that progress is not necessarily always upwards and always onwards. I mean, if you go back in history to the Bronze Age, what's called the Bronze Age collapse, where the earliest incredible civilizations, prior to the discovery of iron in any significant amounts, and arguably sort of roughly where the stories about the fall of Atlantis come from, and the sea people, especially around the Mediterranean basin, which is the area I particularly know a little bit more about than the rest of the world. But it all collapsed horribly. I mean, it's whole city-states just disappeared and left rubble behind them. And it might be environmental change, it might not be. It might be technological change, or just the people shifted and moved away.
Change is so mysterious, isn't it? And you're right. I mean, the fate of the Mayans and the sort of theory of cultural catastrophe theory that talks about the extraordinary development of complexity and then that final moment when the digital straw that breaks the camel back might bring the whole thing tumbling down. Yeah, we're in a really interesting moment, actually. I was in San Francisco the week in which Elon Musk had taken over Twitter. It was also the week in which Meta let go of 11,000 employees, as did a number of other companies around the valley. And FTX, the cryptographic exchange, went bankrupt, owing $36 billion. That's quite a week in showbiz. And I think when you look at all of those different things, and each of them is, has different characteristics and there are different reasons for it. And, the letting go of 11,000 employees from Meta is a direct result of Meta losing 75% of its listed value. These are indicators of significant change. And it is, I think, part of an accumulation of dissatisfaction, of concern, of a recognition at government level that the big players' business models are beginning to do real damage to people. I think that the kind of experience that teenagers have had through lockdown of what Instagram does to their mental health has been shocking to people, but not quite as shocking perhaps as to discover the extent to which Meta may well have been aware of that damage ahead of other people being aware of it and didn't find itself able to do very much about it.
That is particularly shocking, isn't it? I've witnessed that algorithm. I was doing some research on conspiracy theories for a game I'm thinking about. And I found that suddenly my YouTube feed and my social media feed was getting more and more of that kind of stuff. And I'm doing this because I'm interested in doing the research. How do I now get that off the algorithm? Because this isn't something I want to continue to look into. I'm done now with the research. And maybe I should have used a VPN, or maybe I should have done some sort of technique to sort of get rid of it. But that will permanently be on my record unless I do something about it. And I'll probably continue to be flung conspiracy theory style content from time to time as a reminder, with a view that I want to engage with that kind of stuff. And I don't want to engage with it apart from the research. And it's really fascinating how crude the algorithms are and how brute force they really are as well.
And how quickly they take you to really quite objectionable stuff. But I think the thing that's interesting about that, and thinking about what we were saying just a moment ago about Twitter, is that we have come as consumers to think about Facebook and to think about Google and think about Twitter as sort of public utilities. And there is a kind of a shock to us to suddenly discover that actually this thing that we thought was there for the public good isn't there for the public good at all. It's there for the benefit of its own shareholders ahead of anything else. And perhaps in the US, people are more familiar with that sort of mentality and that kind of way of thinking about things because things are that much more commercial and the public sector and public supported things are less strong in the US. But certainly in Europe, I think there's a different view. And in a way, to me, I think this is all part and parcel of a kind of symptomatic change that says maybe the model of Silicon Valley and what Silicon Valley produced isn't the only way to think about things. And maybe we do need to start thinking about things in a somewhat different way. Those large companies can't help themselves at this point. They are beholden to their shareholders. They've got to find a way through this. And at a human level, you can hope that the individuals within the company are trying to do something, but those companies are so large that the kind of nature of the change they need to make is very, very tough. But increasingly, what we're seeing in our work at Digital Catapult, for example, when we're working with early stage companies, is companies wanting to develop interesting businesses using machine learning, but very concerned not to go down that same road. So we've run over the last couple of years now a whole set of workshops and deep dives, bringing all sorts of different people from academia, from other parts of business in to help companies who are trying to work through, how do I make the use of machine learning that takes advantage of the power of it without ending up exploiting my customers or my partners who are sharing data into the business. And it's really tough because, of course, we don't have very many models to point to because the models we have got are ones that we don't really want people to emulate. So we're in a really interesting moment around that. There's the recognition that that needs to change and that we have the opportunity with artificial intelligence and machine learning to do extraordinary things and to bring incredible benefit to the world and potentially, I think, to help us save ourselves from the climate emergency, but only if we use them responsibly and use them ethically. And we need to do everything we can to help those businesses do that and not think that the likes of Meta and Google are the only game in town.
It is down to a matter of ethics. I've written a book on how the rules of chivalry could be applied to modern business. And the rules of chivalry evolved in society to control the sort of more aggressive masculine traits, or to guide them and say, yes, you're big and strong and you can beat people up and you can steal things from lots of people, but could you do it in a sort of guided way for us? Could you kill the right people and not kill the wrong people and all these kind of things? And yes, some of it's very bad by today's standards, but there's an awful lot of things about treating people well and also honoring yourself in terms of having ethics and following them because it's the right thing to do. And if you think about a lot of the Arthurian stories, they are often about flawed people striving for perfection, striving to achieve things in the world, failing, but nonetheless striving. And I feel like the concept of a digital renaissance is almost the medieval period, or maybe the dark ages that never existed. But if you imagine the more free for all, free form, kind of chaotic part of society is what we've come through. And now we're going into a place where we reflect upon what it means to have that data about people, and whether it's fair to continue to serve more and more kind of fringe opinions to people that maybe don't have the mental capacity to think outside that. I mean, we've all seen it in certain aspects of media, the concept of the free for all media and just going for the lowest hanging fruit and going to sort of wind people up. I mean, there are certain networks that are notorious for not really being news, but pretending to be news for certain people.
I love the fact that you're going back to chivalry and to the code of chivalry to kind of inform all of that. What I find interesting is, and I've explored this a little bit in the book through a bunch of different experiences that I've had at working with different companies, is that this is also about the kind of the attitude of founders and the attitude of investors. And that one of the challenges of the kind of the classic Valley approach to investment is that it is a take no prisoners kind of approach. It is a view that says, we are going gangbusters. We are going to make the biggest land grab possible in this area. And we're going to do that as aggressively as possible. The phrase that is often used is blitz scaling.
Oh, wow.
And the word itself, I think, sums it all up. That there needs to be a bit of a change. You know, founders come under immense pressure. And that sense of being driven by your investors to more and more overarching kind of alpha male type behaviors, because these are the ways in which we're going to conquer everything. We've seen what that has done to some businesses, not just to the founders themselves, but actually the people they work with and partners. And, you know, I don't need to repeat the stories of Uber and WeWork. Everybody knows what happened in those companies now. But a lot of the things that happened and went wrong in those big companies went wrong, not least because the founders were really urged on by the investors to keep on going like that. And so I think there might be a different way of approaching this. There needs to be a different way of approaching this. If we've learned one thing through COVID, it was that preserving our mental health and creating a better work-life balance is real. And that if we don't do that, the consequences of it are real. And we're coming out the other side of that with, I think, a more informed sense of our own humanity in business. And I've always hesitated to say these kinds of things because in the back of my mind, there's some macho geezer standing on my shoulder saying, yeah, but you're never going to make a successful company if you behave like that. Because the only models that they can point to are ones where people have pushed through as aggressively as that. And perhaps as we sit in this world where we're trying to take into account these different factors, so, you know, the failings of companies which were originally our hero companies. You know, we were so excited by the growth of Google. It was like, this is the revolution. This is the change that we wanted to be. And yet now it represents absolutely the opposite of that in so many ways. And I suppose my feeling is we've got the opportunity, if we behave more responsibly, if we take a more humane approach to creating businesses and investing in businesses, that we could actually come out with a digital renaissance at the end of it. But we really need to work hard to do that.
Wasn't Google's original motto, do no evil?
Wow.
And then one day, which must have been quite a big PR issue for them, I imagine the meetings ahead, we have to stop saying that. We literally have to stop saying do no evil, in that, what, we are going to do evil then? Is that what you're implying? Well, I don't know. We're not saying we're going to do it, but we're not going to say we're not. It's just really fascinating. But there are other ways of running businesses as well. And I sometimes do consultancy and help people. And I've given talks at business colleges, and people assume the only way to do business is to set up a business, but the business has a meta business, which is to sell shares to investors, to grow, to sell out. Now, I run my company with my brother. I still own half the company after 30 years now. And our goal is to do cool things and make some money along the way and enjoy the process. And I have sat on boards and I've sat in presentations, and everybody in the audience is looking at me like I'm a lunatic. And I'm going, yeah, but my business is very successful and is doing really interesting games and books and comics, YouTube channels, all sorts of stuff. And Yes, we're a business, so we are there to make money, but we're not there to maximize the amount of money at the cost of everything else, at the cost of our souls. And I feel that, A, you're right, investors need to take a little bit more of a holistic approach, in my opinion. The big investors, but then again, they just want to make more money, get their bonuses. The whole system is set up to encourage those numbers to go up, regardless.
So it is the capitalist model to its logical extent, as far as you could take it. And it drives behaviors good and bad, but it makes people a lot of money. And I think that in Europe, there's a slightly different approach that has a little bit more respect for the consumer and a bit more concern for the consumer. But it's still the number of politicians that I've met that still sort of say, well, why can't we create the next Google? And the answer, of course, is, well, there's no reason why we shouldn't create the next Google, but that's not necessarily the objective in all of this. And I suppose the opportunity here is to make technology work for us and to make sure that we don't all end up being slaves to the algorithm. And, you know, we already have a lot of people working, particularly in large tech companies, but not in technical roles, who are slaves to algorithms of one sort or another. Amazon delivery drivers notwithstanding, right? That already exists. And the degree to which the work that we do in Digital Catapult, which is all about trying to encourage industry to make better use of technology, to make its systems more efficient, to make its processes more efficient, to drive success and efficiency and carbon emissions reduction into businesses. But we're trying to do it with a sense of the humanity of everyone involved as well. And that's more difficult, to be honest. It's easier not to. So hats off to you for having a business that takes that approach as well, because I'm sure your staff are the happier for it, and you probably keep your staff for longer because of it.
Yeah, I think we tend to, because the objective is to do cool things and have fun doing it, hopefully, and make some money as well. And I was just going to go back a little bit to the sort of the digital medieval a little bit, because I quite like this idea, which is, what about, do we have digital peasants, digital nobility, and do we have digital outlaws, do you think? You know, the Robin Hood style people that deny it all. Do you think that's a fun thing to look into?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure that we're still not to some extent in this period, but we certainly, if you think back to the early days, and there are the robber barons out there, and they're absolutely out there, and they ran things, well, in my world, because I come from a music background, they ran organizations like Napster or megauploads.com. Remember him?
Yes.
They are absolutely the robber barons of the digital medieval world who, if you were lucky, did actually distribute the wealth to the people.
Hardly at all, though, really. I mean, you know.
Well, they distributed the content.
Yes, the content to people, yes.
And there is a degree of wealth.
Yeah.
And they kept the actual wealth to themselves. And some of them ended up in jail as a result, it has to be said, given that it was all absolutely blatantly illegal. But you're right. And meanwhile, there are the digital serfs. So there are all sorts of people who make a living being Instagram influencers. You know, you're just being a slave to the machine. That is absolute digital serfdom. Having to keep that endless stream of photographs of whatever it is appearing on your Instagram feed in order to continue to win that number of views, in order to continue to get that level of sponsorship that you acquire through other people. But the ecosystem is, digital serfdom. And is there digital royalty? Yeah, of course there is. Yeah. Is Zuckerberg the Henry VIII? The digital world?
I don't know. I don't know how many wives he's had or whether he started a religion or not. Of course, a great split in the world of religions, possibly. What about digital outlaws, though? Are there refuseniks and people that don't engage with it? I know a handful of people that don't have a smartphone, and I didn't have a smartphone for quite a long time. I had an indestructible Nokia phone that did phone calls and was quite useful for phone calls. That was it.
It's interesting, isn't it? When the web first started, some of us got very excited about it, and I was working for a music company at the time. Part of the reason why it was so exciting was because it felt subcultural. It felt like it was something that was, you know, we talk about disruption, and disruption's become a cliche, but I mean, we did think we were doing something disruptive. We did think that we were getting our hands on the means of production, that we could create publications and audio and video streams that otherwise could only come out from corporations. And so I think at the beginning, those early adopters of the web thought that they were the outlaws at that point. I mean, the thing that's extraordinary about it is the journey we've been on, where the web was the terrain of outlaws at the beginning of all of this and is now the place where you do your M&S shopping and your banking. And so that mainstreaming of the web is another aspect of it, which shows you a growth that has, for the most part, made our lives easier and more convenient, but it's also perhaps made it a bit more soulless as well.
Yeah, I think it behooves us all to get outside sometimes and smell the flowers and walk on the grass and see life. I mean, I obviously do quite a lot of things outdoors. I do a lot of filming in YouTube, and YouTube is an interesting one because it has democratized the creation of video content. There is literally no barrier to plonking your phone and recording yourself and uploading it to YouTube and seeing what happens. But of course, there is the tyranny of the algorithm as to whether you're successful or not. And a lot of creators in the YouTube space talk about burnout because they feel pressure to create the next big thing. And because you've got a lot of analytics and a lot of data, you can see how well your latest video is doing compared to the last one. And if you're obsessed with numbers, it puts pressure on you to perform. And there's all of that. So there's an upside and a downside to that kind of stuff. But it does challenge great and august and important institutions like the BBC, because the content on something like YouTube is often very authentic. You know, if you've got somebody like me talking about medieval horses and how to swing a sword from horseback, I actually know how to do that properly. Whereas on the BBC, you might get a presenter talking about a script about how to swing a sword, and you might have an expert come in and just in the background swing a sword.
But what you're talking about is the life and times of the digital serf. Because on the one hand, it gives us access to people like yourself who've got something really authentic and really deeply knowledgeable to talk about and to share. And on the other hand, the motivation for doing that and the means to actually make that into something that makes a living is really, really hard. You know, in the music world, the tools to make music and the means to share music globally around the web have grown massively. So the barriers have come right down. And that has felt revolutionary for a lot of people and is super liberating. And I think is absolutely where we wanted to go. But the reality is that the business models to actually make that sustainable for people are still really, really hard. I mean, there was a staggering figure that came out that talked about the number of new songs or tracks being uploaded to Spotify and to Apple Music every day. 10,000 new tracks a day.
Wow.
That is mind-blowing in terms of how on earth anyone could hope to cut through the noise and actually reach an audience. So I think we've got some new challenges. And the opportunity that the whole cryptocurrency, NFT, metaverse prospect is one that from a creator point of view is really liberating and really exciting. That idea that you can make your own work, you can make an audience and you can get paid for it in an environment. And if cryptocurrency is the means by which you get paid and that cryptocurrency is still worth something at the end of the story, then that's great. The problem we know is that the cryptocurrency has been a little bit up and down in terms of its value. So it is really amazing the trajectory that we've gone on in terms of how fast that we've gone from the subversive to the mainstream. And yet the challenge we've still got to try and turn that into something that can be of real value to people in new ways.
Absolutely. Just to sort of summarize then, just come to a conclusion. Are you a digital optimist or a digital pessimist?
Digital Catapult is full of digital optimists, and I am the chief digital optimistic officer.
Wonderful, wonderful. I would say I'm a bit of both. I'm also slightly digitally nervous in that I know how powerful the digital space can be, and I know that it can be a force for good. I also know that it can be a force for evil, quite frankly. And we've got to somehow, us good actors have got to somehow wrest the positive from the general kind of noise that is the negative as well. It must be possible to have a bright digital future. I'm sure of it. I'm absolutely sure of it.
That's why I wrote the book. That's why I wrote Towards a Digital Renaissance, because I firmly believe that. But I share your concern. And, the scary thing about it is if you think back, going right back to the beginning of our conversation, the things that were inspirational at the beginning of all of this were novels by science fiction writers. And, Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, to Digital Sheep Dream of Androids, the source of Blade Runner. But the thing that unites both of those and other novels like that is they're all based in a really horrible, failed dystopian future.
Yeah, they are. You're absolutely right. They're hope in a digital disaster area, aren't they?
Exactly. They are post-apocalyptic visions of survival. And so I suppose what I'm hoping is that we don't go that way. It doesn't get to that point and trying to encourage people to behave more responsibly, more humanely, but also with that sense of optimism, I think is really, really important, because there's so many kind of media images and stories that drag us in the opposite direction.
I just love the idea of ethics in business, though. I think ethics needs to be a big component of how we teach people and how we educate people about business. That business read in tooth and claw is not really the only thing that matters. It should be work hard, run a business, be tough, but also think about the ethical side of it as well. And I genuinely think we've got to focus on the ethics of things. Just because you can do something, should you actually do it? I think that needs consideration in every field, genetic engineering or digital algorithms or whatever it might be.
It's a very strange thing, but the less people know about business, the more they think that business people are aggressive. But we also have to kind of encourage investors and founders to have the confidence not to be like that.
Yeah.
And there was a view that came out of Harvard Business School in the 90s when an MBA was the most sought after degree. The MBA at that time was a sort of a bloodletting kind of degree. It was a degree that kind of gave you license to go out there and ruthlessly wield the corporate saber of cost cutting to increase efficiencies and so on. And in the corporate world, that mentality, I think, still exists. And I think the pressure from shareholders is still there in corporate boardrooms. In smaller businesses, I think it's easier to take a different approach. But we still have to give people this confidence to believe that that's the right way to behave, and that actually can lead to really satisfying, really successful businesses that can really grow. And we need to create more examples of that and more models of that, because it's tough. It's hard. It's hard to be human.
Hard to be human. Absolutely. That's a great place to finish. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That's been really interesting talking to you. And if people want to see more of your work, Digital Catapult, is there a website they can visit?
Just Google Digital Catapult and you'll find the website easily available. And this marvellous tome that I've produced is coming out at the beginning of December. So
it's called Towards the Digital Renaissance.
Yes.
And presumably it's available through all of the traditional places you can buy books.
I very much hope it will be, yes.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for having me.